So the way this works, as you all know, is that we basically need to answer the question of what is X? And in my case, X is fairy tales. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the term fairy tales. And I'm sure you've heard many fairy tales as children and even now as adults, such as Hansel and Gretel, Cinderella, Beauty and the Beast, The Emperor's New Clothes, and so much more. But in order to answer such a question, one needs to ask a further one. Well, what is fairy tales according to whom? So let's see. All right. So according to Google, a fairy tale is a children's story. And according to children, a fairy tale is a world. According to the world, a fairy tale is nothing but a lie, mostly because they end with, and they lived happily ever after. Nevertheless, what about what happens before the happy part? And what does happily refer to begin with? If we were to examine Cinderella, for example, happily means that her stepsister's feet were cut to fit the shoe, which turned bloody, and their eyes were gouged out by birds. I mean, it is true that in addition to that, she got married to her Prince Charming. So would you call that a happy ending? Accordingly, a fairy tale is not a children's story, and it is not merely a world, and a lie is made to hide the truth. But fairy tales seem rather explicit to an undesirable extent. So if we were to see what scholars have to say in the matter, I would say that providing opinions and definitions by hundreds of scholars is possible, but it would function only as a burden to listeners and a way to overwhelm them with unnecessary details, for such data is accessible to the public reader anywhere, anytime. Thus, projecting these findings at this point would be in vain. Instead, we can differentiate between two approaches. Now, just to make sure you can all see the screen, right?
Yes, we do.
All right, perfect. All right, so we can differentiate between two approaches. Now, the first approach views fairy tales as a study case, a cadaver that must be dissected in a helpless attempt to get to its first cell, to touch upon its origin, to dig deep inside its system, to make assumptions on the function of each system, each organ, each cell, each organelle. A fairy tale is put on the cold metal table with hundreds of doctors and researchers peeking through its holes and making use of every cell they can, getting too close to the body that the picture no longer appears as vivid and clear, rather overwhelming and blurry at times. It is an alluring way to understand what a fairy tale is, and the most commonly followed one as well. But just as in a fairy tale, one must be cautious where to step, which trail to follow, and which road to take. Now, a fairy tale offers a test for those who would like to experiment with it and to reveal its secrets. Scholars who choose to study fairy tales are fully aware of its grand power that allowed it to sustain for so long and to keep flourishing, transforming, and coming back to its original form over and over and over again. The truth is that the power of fairy tales does not lie within the lines of the story. Rather, it accompanies the genre in all of its shapes and merges with our own surroundings. Thus, conducting a study on fairy tales is a road filled with tempting traps. One way to successfully fall into such traps is to mistake the fairy tale with a normal story, one that ought to behave like a story, filling in all the missing details, and giving choice to characters who act according to the tale. While some adaptations manage to preserve the tales and pass the test, others simply fail. An example of such failure, in my opinion, can be seen in the new Mulan movie. I don't know if you've seen it. I believe that it has such a great potential to be an extraordinary adaptation. But trying so hard to make it convey certain, in this case, feminist messages, sort of ruined the beauty of the tale itself and eventually broke the magical spell. Notice that the addition is not the problem, rather the way it has been forced to fit into the tale in such a plain, dull manner. Now, another way to fall into these traps is to assume that a fairy tale is its own culture and start conducting studies on what we can understand of the nature of a certain nation depending merely on their fairy tales. Well, it is true that a fairy tale tells us about its own people, yet one must keep in mind that it is not a reflection of them as much as they are not a reflection of it. You can find many examples in which a fairy tale, though resembles the culture in which it is told, does not reflect the morals of that society, rather sends a disturbing image of it, or a completely alien one. That is due to the fact that fairy tales are not a one-to-one match of their tellers, and I'm afraid that many great scholars tend to fall into such a trap, completely oblivious to the dangers of such claims. I was once watching an interview of one well-known fairy tale researcher whose talk I found enriching and interesting, until she told the audience that, unfortunately, Arabs behave the way people do in the Arabian Nights. Fairy tales have been told for centuries. Each nation, each group, each person draws whatever indications they wish to hear from fairy tales. Thus, it is important to see the thin line between what is a reliable source and what is simply not, and also to what extent. A fairy tale is not made to play the role of a helpless kidnapper. A fairy tale knows fully well how to keep itself alive. So sometimes turning it into a Frankenstein does not always pay back the way experts expect. Now, the second approach views fairy tales as an ancient magical creature, and immortal to some extent. It travels throughout the world swiftly and spreads like a whisper. It travels from the east to the west, from the south to the north, and every place it touches becomes enchanted. In every place, it leaves a shadow of its own, and the people who get to see it dress it as they please to make it fit into their society. And sometimes they dress it the way they please in order to make it exotic and present it as thus to make it a tale of wonder. Take, for example, the tale of Jbani. One can say that it is the Palestinian version of Cinderella. You can imagine her, Jbani, in a Palestinian dress instead of a ball gown. I'd like to note that this tale has also German origins. This indicates that fairy tales travel from one place to another and adapt to the place they arrive at. But they do not completely abandon their identities. One of the reasons that led me to study fairy tales is the foreignness of certain morals and beliefs in local fairy tales that have nothing to do with either our culture nor our religion. One example of that can be seen in the fact that the evil, wicked character in Jbani is a black slave, and she keeps asking her master, Jbani, to let them exchange places. And the narration draws attention to this and some other similar indications that not only reveal the discrimination between people due to their skin color, but also highlights that it is the norm and that is the way things must turn out to have that happy ending. Again, we go back to the happy ending that is not so happy and peaceful after all, rather disturbing and extreme. So back to the first question. What is a fairy tale? A fairy tale is an enchanting tale. It has been preserved because we are enchanted by it. Yet be careful, for a beauty is a beauty until you find out precisely what makes it look so unique and astonishing. Then it loses its magic, though not its beauty. In his essay on fairy tales, J.R.R. Tolkien warns that one thing must not be made fun of, the magic itself. That must in that story be taken seriously, neither laughed at nor explained away. Thus, one needs to subdue to the fact that fairy tales were and always will sustain their magic, as long as we do not ruin it by forcing it to become what it is not, instead of letting it transform naturally. Fairy tales is an inheritance that, although can survive on its own, we as heirs need to learn how to preserve it. Now, before I finish, I would like to add that before I began working on this, I thought that I would go for what we had discussed earlier in class, and I would write about Palestinian fairy tales and the definition of fairy tales, which is associated with, fiction, fantasy, lies, and such, as an answer to the claim, or let's say the view, that Palestine does not exist. That Palestine is an illusion, a fairy tale. And the punchline would be, as we had discussed, that Palestinians are real enough to have their own fairy tales. However, after a second thought, I realized how absurd and naive it would be to defend what is obvious. I mean, imagine writing an essay proving that a table is a table. And in that case, our efforts would only be in vain. And that is, by the way, one way to become an unreliable narrator. So if you were asking about the political part in this presentation, would be, in fact, the decision of eliminating the political part. And thank you very much.